So hello, everyone. As Robert is trying to find the best lighting position for the presentation, I'll go ahead and start with my intro. If you're not familiar with who we are, what we do, my name is Pete Timmerman. I'm the director of the Webster University Film Series. The Webster Film Series has been in operation for about 42 years and was begun, I should add, by one of Robert Hunt, the speaker tonight, one of his friends, David Kinder. But that's, I guess, not the topic of conversation tonight. But anyway, the film series was begun 42 years ago by David Kinder. We're St. Louis' only year-round nonprofit movie theater. Under normal circumstances, we show movies in the Winifred Moore Auditorium, which is on the main campus at Webster University in Webster Groves, Missouri. We haven't been able to lately because of the pandemic, obviously. Since March of last year, we haven't been doing in-person screenings, and I don't know quite when we're going to get back to it. In the reasonably near future, hopefully, but any guess I've made in the past year has been wrong, so I'll refrain from guessing now. But while we can't put on in-person screenings, we've moved to doing some virtual events like the one that you're attending here tonight. We also have movies in our so-called virtual cinema. They're first-run films, new films, restorations of older films, things like that, that we would have shown in person in Winifred Moore if the opportunity presented itself. But since we can't, we're doing them online. As I speak, there's only one film in the virtual cinema. It's a Ukrainian film called Atlantis. It was Ukraine's submission to the Academy for Oscar consideration this year. Tonight is the last night you can rent Atlantis. It's $12 for a 72-hour rental. But if you rent it tonight, you do get the full 72 hours, despite the fact that you can't start a new rental. It's like tomorrow even. But then tomorrow we've got another film opening in the virtual theater. It's a new French documentary, Un Film Dramatique. Un Film Dramatique is it focuses on 21 middle schoolers in a newly founded school just outside of Paris. And the middle schoolers were given some authority to actually help in making the film. It's not, I feel like that sounds, I don't know, a little too cute. It's not as cute as you're probably envisioning. It's along the lines of some film series hits in the past. And also there have been a lot of recent French films set in schools, both like The Class and Etre à Voir and, oh geez, I had another one. The Competition, which we ran at the film series a couple of years ago. It's also sort of along the lines of the American documentary Chain Camera, if you saw that. That was at the film series maybe 20 or so years ago. But anyway, that one's going to be available starting tomorrow. I also wanted to mention tonight is the last of our Fassbinder February events, but our filmmaker that we're focusing on starting in March is Sofia Coppola. So a week from tonight, we're going to do the first quote unquote March of Coppola film, which is Lost in Translation. And the featured speaker that night is Dr. Dan Yesbeck. Dan Yesbeck is one of those people, I'll introduce him more thoroughly next week, of course, when he does the event. But he just does a whole lot of stuff. He's full-time at St. Louis Community College, but he's an adjunct at Webster, and he also writes a lot of stuff, and he does all kinds of things. But it should be a lot of fun. So that's next week. I hope that you sign up and check that out, and we'll post the full announcement for all the March of Coppola events in the very near future. The best place to get information about what we're up to, you can either go to our website, it's webster.edu/film series, or you can follow us on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, we're at WU Film Series, and on Facebook, we're at Webster Film Series. There's also an email list we can get you on board with too if you want to direct message either me or Jessica Pierce, who's working behind the scenes tonight. Maybe don't bother Robert with getting added to an email list though. So with that all said, tonight the featured speaker is Robert Hunt. I imagine if you know him, you are familiar with him as a film critic. He's been a film critic in St. Louis for a matter of decades. Correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, but you're mostly affiliated with the RFT. That's where I always read your work.
I was with the different times for from 1981 through 1983. I threw a fit over Return of the Jedi and quit. Unfortunately, a true story. And then I came back in the late 80s, early 90s for about a 6-year run. And then when Ray Hartman sold the paper, they gradually got rid of local writers. And then when it was sold again about 4 years ago, they asked me back on. And now the future is indefinite, since I haven't really heard from them since last March.
All right. Well,
so it's not the only publication, but it was a long spell.
Of course. Yeah, I knew that you'd written for a bunch of different local ones. I just read you the most often in the RFT, so that's what I associated you with.
Sure.
We've got you billed as a recovering film critic at your own request. You're also perhaps a recovering college professor. When I was an undergrad, I had you as a professor in at least 3 different classes, but it's noteworthy that you taught me a class specifically on Fassbinder. And I bring that up because I hope if I've made a fool of myself this month, you'll blame Robert and not me. It is clearly his fault. But no, when I took the Fassbinder class, we were just discussing earlier this week, one of the films that wasn't on the syllabus was The Third Generation. So I'm excited to hear your presentation about it tonight. I guess one last thought on that front was I took your class in spring of 2003, and then summer of 2003, the Webster Film Series showed a whole bunch of Fassbinder films in person in a retrospective in Winifred Moore, and you introduced some or all of those.
I introduced one a week, I think, because I did it several times a week. So I
Right.
think I did 4 in. I think I did 4 in all. It's a lot. It
Yeah.
was what had happened was a company that currently had the rights to the Fassbinder films. I think it was Kino Lorber, but they had been planning to release all these films in a retrospective. But unfortunately, that was going to be after the time of the class, and so that's why we ended up delaying the film series. So, as I recall. So.
Yeah, so I've heard you speak about a lot of Fassbinder films, kind of a lot of times, all things considered, because the class was 8 weeks long and you had a couple of double features, and I came and saw you a bunch of times in the summer. So it'll be like
Right.
old times for me, and everybody else, it'll be a new experience. But anyway, I'll shut up now and let Robert take the floor, but I'll return. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll address the questions at the end of Robert's presentation. But now, thank you, Robert, and I will get out of the way.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm kind of new to this sort of thing, other than having family meetings on it. The Third Generation, the film we're going to be, that I assume many of you have already seen, is not one of Fassbinder's more familiar films, and that's not entirely because of the Netflix culture amnesia that we all are living under these days. It's not entirely an easy film, and it helps to have kind of a understanding of the time and the context in which it was made, but that's hardly unique to complicated films either. I think there's actually a fairly mundane reason why it's not quite as well known or revived as, let's say, The Marriage of Maria Brown or Fox and His Friends. Fassbinder, as most of you probably know, was extraordinarily prolific. Despite his unfortunately short life, he died just a few days after his 37th birthday. But if you count short films and television series, he directed more than 40 films in a 17-year period. The IMDb lists 44 films, but the Garrett Institute lists 46. And obviously, when you have that many films, it's hard to keep up. His first film, a 1966 short, is completely lost. There's a 1981 documentary, Theater in Trance, which I read about in a German trade paper in 1981. I don't know that it's ever been screened publicly anywhere. And for many years, his Western Whitey was only available within a single print that was held at a German cinematheque and in such bad condition that you had to view it on an editing table. It has since been restored and released on DVD, by the way. So, in other words, there's a lot of Fassbinder material out there, so it's understandable that some of it just sort of falls through the cracks, or it just simply doesn't make the same impact that other films did. So, when you're looking at an artist as prodigious as Fassbinder, it's difficult to classify the films or break them down into different periods. It might be more accurate to look at them as having all sorts of simultaneous threads, sometimes interweaving. You know, there's the Cirque-inspired melodramas like Ali and Fox and His Friends and Mother Coosters. There's the literary adaptations like Effie Briest. There's period pieces. There's historical films like the BRD trilogy. And starting around 1976, he also began this trend of harder to define films, very acerbic films like Satan's Brew, Chinese Roulette, Despair, In a Year with 13 Moons, which I believe some of you have just seen recently. And The Third Generation would go in that group. These last groups give a kind of bitter, aggressive side to Fassbinder. He's being deliberately provocative and fairly insolent in them. The Third Generation, as the titles told you, was filmed in the winter of 1978 through 79. Fassbinder just had a worldwide success with The Marriage of Maria Brown. Offers for international co-productions were coming in, and he was about to start filming one of his dream projects, the 15.5-hour adaptation of the novel Berlin Alexanderplatz. And I think it's characteristic of the kind of talent and restlessness he had that rather than rest on the cusp of fame there, between these high-profile projects, he made two of his most inventive and challenging films back to back. One of those was The Year with 13 Moons, and the other is The Third Generation. And I think it's a good sign of his commitment to these films that he made them even after being rejected by his usual funding sources, the National Film Board and the television networks of Germany. And he also, and this is unique to his filmography, these are the only two films where he acted as his own cinematographer. So I think that's a strong sign of just how personally committed he was to these two projects. I think one of the reasons is that he probably considered them to be very personal films. In A Year with 13 Moons for obvious reasons, but also the Amphitheater, the group that he had been working with since he was, I think, not even 20 years old yet, was becoming sort of splintered. And as he faced bigger budgets and bigger projects and professional technical sources and international casts, he had sort of stepped away from the kind of improvised, loose, low budget filmmaking that he and his fellow actors had begun with. So I think this gave him a chance, this film gave him a chance to work sort of fast and loose with a lot of the actors that he'd been putting in films for over 10 years at that point. It's also a film that gives him a rare chance to indulge in a kind of cinephilia, something you don't see Fassbinder do very often. Even cinephilia towards his own films. Margaret Carstensen of Petra von Kant again plays a woman named Petra. The always reliable Gunther Kaufmann plays a character named Franz, which is his Fassbinder's favorite name for any kind of underdog character, and a sort of a nod towards the film he was about to make, Berlin Alexanderplatz. And of course, the presence of Eddie Constantine inevitably invokes Godard's Alphaville. And there's also a scene of Udo Kier and Hanna Schygulla as they're getting disguised, in which he recreates some shots from Godard's Contempt. The large apartment and the sweeping camera around it were an attempt to recall some of the similar spaces in Luchino Visconti's film Conversation Piece, one of the influences on the film, according to Fassbinder. And at the beginning, there's a phone call from a character named Mr. Curtis, which clearly indicates the Hungarian film director Michael Curtis, whose melodrama Flamingo Road is also cited as an influence on this film. There are scenes in which two characters discuss Tarkovsky's Solaris. And in the opening scene, Hanna Schygulla is watching the Robert Bresson film The Devil Probably, another favorite of Fassbinder's, and one that he also invokes in the scene with Franz's death. So, Fassbinder often spoke about his love for other filmmakers and films, but it's rare to see him doing that kind of French New Wave kind of cinephilic grab bag of effects. And I will add that in a not entirely serious list that he published in 1981, Fassbinder listed both this film and In the Year of 13 Moons as among his 10 best. But he also added a list of the 10 most important directors of the new German cinema, and guess whose name he put on the top? Another thing I want to note briefly is that even considering the rapid pace in which Fassbinder always worked, he makes a noticeable effort to remind you that The Third Generation is a film of its moment. From its opening shot, which is a city skyline framed in a window with a computer screen on one end and a TV on the other, and the titles are flashing like letters on a computer monitor, at least a computer monitor circa 1979. He wants you to see that this is a film about what is happening today being 1979. Even including, as I said, in the opening credits, the dates in which the thing was actually filmed. The Third Generation is often described as a film about terrorism, which is a term that didn't quite carry the same connotations it has now, and certainly held a much, much higher position in Germany's cultural fabric at that time than it did in the US. So to understand how Fassbinder came to make this film, it might be useful to have a sort of abbreviated look at some of the political issues of 1970s Germany. Now, I'm no historian, so this will inevitably be an incomplete account, and one that I'm sure somebody out there can correct me on. The 1960s saw a great deal of political and social rebellion and protest movements throughout Europe, just like they did in America. And while the American protests pretty much centered on the war in Vietnam, those in Europe tended to be broader in scope and largely critical of existing governments and existing social structures. And this all sort of peaked in 1968 with the May riots in France, when they managed to bring the whole country to pretty much a halt for a month. But in the long run, there were very few real long-term gains from a lot of this activity. So in discussing his film, Fassbinder referred to that period as the first generation. He described them somewhat dismissively as idealists who wanted to change the world and imagined they could do it with words and rallies. Now, in the 1970s, in many countries, especially Germany, political conflict sort of escalated. And the most notable sign of this in Germany was the Baader-Meinhof group. This officially known as the Red Army faction. This was a small group of former activists who moved past protesting to actually committing kidnapping, bombing, bank robberies. By 1972, most of the leaders of that group had been in prison, but there were followers who continued to act in their name. This, according to Fassbinder, was the second generation, the group which went from legality to armed struggle and total illegality in his description. Now, he had known some of the actual Baader-Meinhof group in their earlier days, prior to back when it was just regular protest groups, and he once said they were the reason that his phone was tapped. And at the same time, on the other side of the political spectrum, the German right was fueled by a powerful media chain that stirred up hatred, kind of hard to imagine, right? And encouraged the government to clamp down hard on the protest movement. And things came to an extremely ugly head in the autumn of 1977 with a series of violent events. There was a terrorist group, not the Baader-Meinhof group, but a group that kidnapped the head of a major corporation, hijacked a plane to Mogadishu, and their demands included the release from prison of the Baader-Meinhof group. The police and the security forces basically made a huge attack on the plane. All the hijackers were shot, all but one of them were killed. And at around the same time, the three members of the Baader-Meinhof group that were in prison were found dead in their cells. It's now regarded as a deliberate group suicide, but at the time it seemed suspicious to a lot of people. It looked like military forces and security forces were coming down very, very hard, and at least one historian has said that people felt like Germany was on the verge of a civil war. Now, like the cinematic new waves of the 60s and 70s, the new German cinema was a product of that kind of social climate. So it's hardly surprising that the political tensions like that are reflected in a lot of the new German cinema films. In The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum, directed by Volker Schlondorff and Margaret von Trotta, and based on a Heinrich Böll novel, a young woman has a brief affair with a man who's accused of terrorism, and this leads to her own persecution by the police and also in the media. This was partly Böll's response to the way the right-wing media treated him. Alexander Kluge, one of the leaders of the new German cinema, made a film called Strongman Ferdinand about a security guard with delusions of anti-communist grandeur. And a huge popular film, the equivalent of an Academy Award winner, Reinhard Hoff's Knife in the Head, was about an innocent bystander who developed amnesia after being shot by police during a protest. And he becomes a hero to the left and a scapegoat for the authorities. They try to blame them for all sorts of things, when in fact he was just walking by. Now, Fassbinder's most overt display of sympathy for that protest movement was to take part in a film called Germany in Autumn, which was a collectively produced film with contributions by Kluge, Schlondorff, Böll, and 9 other directors. And Fassbinder's contribution was a very strange piece. It's kind of a self-parody in which he plays himself as kind of a loutish, drunken, argumentative person who debates the Mogadishu hiding and the hijacking and the Baader-Meinhof suicides with both his lover Armin and his mother. So his position is actually hesitant and somewhat evasive. It's not. He seems to be saying basically that he doesn't know what to think about these things. So late 1978, just a year after all this, he begins filming The Third Generation, and his thoughts about terrorism have become, I think, a little bit clearer. Now, remember that he defined the first generation of terrorists as idealists, and the second generation was the Baader-Meinhof group. So what is the state of political activism as the 70s come to an end in Germany? The third generation, Fassbinder told an interviewer, is already there today. They simply act without thinking. They don't have an ideology, nor do they have politics, and surely without being aware of it, they allow themselves to be led like a herd of sheep by others. And he later clarified this. He said, people who don't have any reason, any motivation, any despair, any utopia can easily be used by others. And that's what the third generation is essentially about. The third generation is about terrorism as practiced by people who aren't very good at it. And it turns out they don't need to be. It's about the members of a political cell who are, it's so loosely organized that the members are most of the time too busy talking to hear any orders from anybody else. They can't see that they're just figures in a circle that binds the cell with its targets and its opponents. For example, Suzanne, the character played by Hannah Schygulla, works for PG Lertz, the head of a computer company. That's Eddie Constantine. And it gets more complicated because Suzanne sometimes sleeps with her husband's father, Gerhard, who's the head of the police investigating terrorists. And Lertz is working with August, the head of the cell, to help use them to attack his company to help boost computer sales. Fassbinder described the film as both a fairy tale and a parlor game. And you can tell the characters, especially the female characters, really enjoy the game. The men seem to be somewhat bewildered by it. It's a lot like a game of, say, Clue, where the characters are exploring a set of scenarios and they don't really know the outcome. And terrorism for them has become a kind of entertainment. It has become a game. And Miss Peacock's pretty excited about the idea of setting off a bomb in the observatory. The meetings of the cell in the film seem more like suburban cocktail parties than political strategizing. The members are always talking, usually at the same time. They're always competing with the television, which is always on. One interview referred to this technique in the film as acoustic terrorism. Fassbinder wanted to show the relentlessness of the media, the constant noise that had come to underlie life. And for the film's characters, it's an environment they've come to accept. Even if they're not actually watching TV, they always want that noise behind it. They always seem to be responding in some way to it. The Bulle Ogier character listens to what appear to be erotic self-help lectures or something. Today these people would be on YouTube giving tips on how to write aliases and collect safe houses and unboxing bomb-making supplies. So building on this, Fassbinder sees terrorism as new media, as a form of entertainment. And Petra, Suzanne, all the characters in this film are avid consumers. They're eager to try out all of the props and traditions that go along with the game. So Fassbinder pushes this to extremes, most obviously in the extravagant final section where the characters are wearing gaudy carnival costumes and Hannah Schygulla's in clown makeup. The idea of terrorism as a game or a hobby or as a kind of role-playing is the essence of his view of this post-ideological activism. And in an essay about the film, he said, "I'm convinced they don't know what they are doing, and what they are doing derives its meaning from nothing more than the activity itself, from the apparently exciting danger, from petty adventures within the system, which admittedly is administered more perfectly and therefore alarmingly. Action undertaken in danger, but without any sense of perspective, adventure experienced for the sort of intoxication for its own sake. These are the things that motivate the third generation." Now, just as a digression here, what are Fassbinder's own politics? It's very hard to pin them down in any coherent way, but there's no reason why an artist is required to have a coherent political position, right? Why should they be different than anybody else? In interviews, Fassbinder would often show respect for the idea of anarchy. He even suggested that anarchists would be the fourth generation. And while some of his films certainly indulge that kind of anarchic streak, I think we also have to sort of take that within the context of his carefully cultivated public image. He once said, "I don't throw bombs, I make films." There are characters in Fassbinder's films who make ideological points or side with a particular party or represent this or that system. But the real politics to Fassbinder comes in the way people treat each other. We can safely assume that Fassbinder subscribed to the popular dogma of the day that the personal is political. And political struggles in Fassbinder's films can take the form of a love affair or the dynamics of a family. It's a common theme to his earlier films like Mother Coosters and Ali and The Merchants of Four Seasons. But it's treated much more broadly in these later dark films like Satan's Brew and The Third Generation. In these films, human relationships are no longer reliable indexes because the family dynamics or the family itself has degenerated into a kind of chaos. Now, the group of terrorists in The Third Generation would like to see themselves as a swift and exact military unit working very smoothly, and yet they can barely handle ordinary life with the messy details and messier relationships. They're all kind of falling apart in one way or another. They lack commitment, and more importantly, they lack competence. They pretend to have serious principles, but they tend to behave fairly childishly. We see them playing games, we see them taunting each other. There's even one scene where you see them playing a game of keep away like a pack of sixth grade bullies. As the activity of the cell escalates and the stakes rise, their behavior escalates as well. It becomes more ridiculous, leading to that final sort of Alice in Wonderland quality of the final scene where they are wearing the cartoon costumes and the division between the industrialist and the terrorists has become a complete blur. The spectacle, the flash, the role playing, the costumes, these are a distraction which Fassbinder uses to slip in actually some more effective aspects in the film. And that's one of the things that really struck me watching it a third time recently. Anybody who has seen a lot of Fassbinder knows that beneath that biting, cynical exterior, he's actually a closet romantic. He's a chronicler of doomed love, broken hearts, a keen observer of human nature, and all the ways in which people manage to hurt each other. And while the third generation is primarily the story of the cell and their increasingly violent and unstable transformation, through it all, there's another story, a kind of a subplot that offers a very different way of looking at the group. And with so many characters running around and competing for screen time, and this is a film with what, 8, 9 separate and distinct characters, it may not be quite as clear on a first viewing, but there's a real emotional center in an otherwise cynical film. I said that most of the characters in the film have a poor grasp of ordinary behavior. And this becomes fairly clear early on. The first time we visit the apartment of Rudolph, the record store clerk, he's been providing a bedroom for Ilsa, a young drug addict. She's often sitting right in the center of the apartment, but she doesn't pay attention to the rest of the group. She doesn't appear to have been part of them. She's solely focused on getting drugs. And the members of the cell treat her horribly. August, the leader, continually tells Rudolph to throw her out. The other people talk about her behind her back as if she can't even hear them. She's an unknown quantity. She's an unpredictable factor right in the middle of their dream of organization. And she's also the catalyst for a major portion of the film that strikes a counterbalance to the political events and the behavior of the cell. In the second of the film's 6 sections, and I believe the sections are almost purely arbitrary, so I won't make too much of that, 2 men show up at the apartment looking for Ilsa. And one of them, Franz, played by Gunther Kaufmann, is clearly in love with Ilsa. He's devoted, and at first he's a little bit naive. He says at one point that he thinks she might be on drugs. He's also brought along a friend, Bernard, who's this idealist who reads political theory. And although Ilsa's story ends badly and provides the film with what may be its most sincere emotional moment, she's opened the door for these 2 characters who provide, by contrast, some of the strongest perspectives on the way the cell and the other characters are behaving. They are the film's moral center. They're the ones who remain rational when everyone else has gone out of control. They get swept up in the activity of the group, but they're never entirely accepted. They're never really able to cross that line into terrorist cosplay with the rest of the group. And needless to say, neither of them survives. Bernard represents the kind of political commitment that the third generation has abandoned. They even make fun of him. He's the one whose books of political theory they're playing keep away with. His idealism makes him an ideal victim, an ideal patsy. And when the cell goes into hiding, he's somehow the one who's left behind and stuck to face the police. He's trying to cling to the old reasoning, the argument, the old political positions, but he doesn't realize that there's no place for that kind of thinking anymore in their kind of terrorism. The police and the cell are playing a mutually beneficial game, and he's stuck in the past believing that theory still matters. So he doesn't know what to do about it. And he uncovers August's deception. He understands what's really going on. But rather than betray the group, he probably kills himself. Now, Franz is an even more complex and tragic figure. When Ilsa dies, he stays within the cell. but he never fully fits in. We sense that unease. We sense his gradual awareness that that this group just isn't functioning properly. In the party scene, for example, that opens section 4, where everybody's talking at once and the TVs are blaring and somebody's singing a song and it's just pure cacophony. He's the only one that objects. He's the only one that wonders why they're carrying on like that. But he has to make a choice. He has to choose between the increasingly irrational pursuits of the group or his devotion to the memory of Ilsa. And he goes with the latter. And like Bernhard, like even the arrogant marksman Paul, who is recruited by the group, he's sacrificed. Those who get swept up in the circle of the third generation are destroyed, but the group itself lives on, increasingly erratic. The hopelessness of Ilsa, the hysteria of Bernard, the loyalty of France, all of these things counterbalance the triviality and the delusion of the cell members. They provide a kind of human element that is missing from the cat and mouse of the capitalist Lurs, the police henchman, August, the manipulative cell leader, and the self-absorbed terrorists of the third generation. And watching Franz's discomfort in the shadow of these ineffectual people, I was reminded of what may be a very unlikely influence. I don't know if it's something Fassbinder was particularly familiar with, although it would not surprise me. And that's F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. At the end of that novel, there's the idealistic Gatsby has been destroyed, and the couple of Tom and Daisy, who have sort of been a mechanism for all this, just go off on their merry way, oblivious to all the tragedy they're leaving behind. And the narrator, Nick Carraway, says, these were careless people. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess they had made. That kind of behavior, that kind of disregard of the consequences, those are the results of action without any sense of adventure experienced in a sort of intoxication for its own sake that Fassbinder described or indicted the characters of the third generation. So as a satirist, Fassbinder condemns their politics, condemns their corruptibility, but he also exposes a more banal crime, the lives that they just blithely disregard and destroy. And to me, that's the surprising and touching thing about the third generation. It's a satire about terrorism, but it's also this tragedy about people who get sort of overwhelmed and walked over by the whole group. With that, I think we can turn this over to any questions people have, or
okay.
whatever the procedure.
As we give people a chance to type in some questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, I've got a few on my own. Okay. One thing I was hoping you would address, you're a favorite speaker of Cinema St. Louis in general and Cliff Freilich in specific. And I remember you spoke at the very memorable SLIF screening of Goodbye to Language, one of the newer Jean-Luc Godard films at SLIF a few years back.
Yes.
I was hoping you could, not that film specifically, but address the Godard connection in the third generation. You talked about how it visually quotes Contempt, for example, but there's the very deliberate line about how film lies 25 times per second. And I feel like the chapterization seems like a nod in the direction of Viva Sa Vie, which Fassbinder has long been, he was an outspoken fan of. There are a lot of little things like that. But yeah, I was hoping you could talk about that some.
Well, Fassbinder was known to admire Godard. And Viva Sa Vie, he mentioned, is one of his favorite films many, many times. He did work with Anna Karina in the film Chinese Roulette. I also think it was against his nature to make too strong of a comparison of himself to anyone else. The breaking of the film to chapters is certainly not unique to, but certainly a Godardian element. It's a very important factor in Viva Sa Vie. And even if, as I said, I feel like the divisions themselves are somewhat arbitrary. Only one of them, I would say, is a really self-contained sort of unit in itself. But they're also a way of making the audience look at things different. They're a way of making you stop and say, oh, like a chapter break. In Godard's case in Viva Sa Vie, he will tell you what's going to happen in the next scene. Chapter 1, Nana is going to do this or that. And it's a way of making you aware that, yes, you're in the middle of a story. Someone is telling this to you. In Fassbinder's case, the chapters are all punctuated with graffiti that he pulled out of restrooms at the time. So I'm not sure there's a great context there. And then having said that, I mean, Fassbinder, when in the late 70s, when people were first discovering Fassbinder's work, it was inevitable that he was compared to Godard for, if nothing else, because they both had this habit of making 3 or 4 movies a year. I think in certain ways, they're very different. And yet one of the things that, because Fassbinder had much more of a taste for melodrama, much more for a taste for certain kinds of romances that Godard rejected just almost from the beginning. But I do think a lot of his films, not the period ones, but especially Third Generation, some of the very early ones, they have the same Godardian quality of wanting you to, I can't remember the phrase now, but the idea that this is a film coming right off the streets today. This is what our world is like as of this minute. And that's a very rare thing. I was watching Masculine and Feminine and some other Godard films recently, and it occurred to me, nobody's making a film that says this is what 2021 is like these days. You don't get that real sense of pulling the thoughts of people on the street. And sort of, now, in Fassbinder's case, of course, the Third Generation is also kind of a fantasy. It's kind of a cartoon, but it's still rooted in the idea of its own period, the contemporariness of it. And I think that one of the reasons that he brings Eddie Constantine into it, because you can't look at Eddie Constantine and not think of Alphaville. And Alphaville was also a film that was shot on the streets of contemporary 1966 Paris, and yet it's supposed to be a fantasy, a science fiction film. You're supposed to believe that you're in the future with all great things, and it's just the plain old ordinary buildings that people are walking through every day anyway. And so Fassbinder, coming from the theater tradition, is more inclined to keep to interiors and he doesn't go out and shoot on the streets the way Godard and Roland Coutard did. But I do think that idea that they want to say something about what's going on today is important to how he works, even if their sense of drama and other things are very, very different. The reference to contempt, I have to admit, surprised me when I noticed it. And it's only partially successful because Contempt is a film about 2 specific people, and the 2 people in this case are just 2 among 8. But that sense that they're a couple that are going about their business and acting very ordinary, and in fact have completely lost control of everything, which is essentially the message of what happens to Michel Piccoli in Contempt. I think that might be a something of the reason for that. So yeah, I think I would not be surprised if Godard was the kind of influence that Fassbinder probably felt he had to deliberately not reject the way Godard rejected a lot of his sort of father figures and things, but at least, acknowledge without trying to appear like he's too influenced. It did occur to me just the day after Fassbinder died, there was in fact talk of one of his unfinished screenplays being directed by Godard. It never happened, but there was, and I don't know that Godard has ever spoken much about Fassbinder, but he did also use Hannes Schygulla in a film at around that same time, so he was certainly aware of him. I mean, their circumstances were very different in a lot of ways. Their nationalities were very different, and so it's hard to say there. But certainly from the new wave and from Godard, Fassbinder gets that immediacy, that chance that you use everything that comes to you, and that you're not tied into traditional narratives, among other things. It's not blatant, but it's probably always an important influence of how Fassbinder came to start making films in the first place, and perhaps much more so than anybody else in new German cinema. Certainly more than Herzog. Maybe not Venice. So that so the Godard influence is kind of interesting, but more probably indirect would be my guess.
All right. Kind of on that note, we've got a question from the audience. Joshua Ray, who presented on the first night of Fassbinder February, he says, not to make everything exclusively about connections, but he wants to know if you have seen Bertrand Bonello's Nocturama. It's very much the Third Generation with a dash of The Bling Ring and Dawn of the Dead. Nocturama, have you seen it?
It's been a while. Bonello is a director who I can't quite put my finger on yet. I've seen a couple of his films and I like them, but I'm not quite sure. There is a blatant sort of grotesque side to them that is fascinating, but also kind of hard to warm to. Um, so I would love to actually turn to Nocturama again. I think I just saw a copy of my shelf a few weeks ago and was thinking about it. But Bonello, I have not made my mind up yet or exactly how he fits in. Certainly as part of the post new wave kind of generation, he's aware of the kind of influences and the kind of history there, which is why he uses Jean-Pierre Loud and other people like that in his films, which is interesting. And yet also, if you look at the film where Lowe played, was it Louis the 14th? I forgot which king
That's
it was.
Albert Serra, yeah.
Oh wait, you're right. That's Sarah. Okay, no, but he's in the film of pornographers. The Bonello. That's right. The pornographers one. Okay. Yeah, it's he's clearly aware of that he's working within a tradition that's not that is kind of unique to certain kinds of films. But I haven't seen enough of Bonello's work and don't completely warm up to what I have seen enough to really make a decision on that yet. He's like for future reference in my in my mind.
I was wondering, I feel like this is a question with maybe a one-word answer, but I was going to ask it anyway. How much of a joke and how much we're supposed to read into the fact that the terrorists at one point get bored and play Monopoly, specifically Monopoly?
In a way that's almost too obvious, right? Oh yeah, they're capitalists after all. I mean, it's almost making too much. I don't know how well known the game of Monopoly is in Europe, or if the rules are any different or anything like that. But it wouldn't surprise me. But I mean, it sort of fits in with everything else about their personalities. So in some ways, it made perfect sense. But yeah, it's almost like showing his hand too early. It's almost like giving away the ending, right? So,
I guess I maybe should have followed up my Godard question with this one. You talked in your presentation about like the experience of the film on an audio level, about how Fassbinder is constantly layering things and things like that. Do you have a read on what it's like to view this film as a native German speaker? Like, for example, with Godard, he was always so prone to mixing like the dialogue very low on the soundtrack. So if you speak French, half the time you can't understand what they're hearing. And I've always kind of gotten that impression from this film too, that like he's kind of deliberately obscuring what people are saying. Is that right?
I did get that sense. In fact, when they go into the record store, for example, the record is probably louder. They're playing a record which happens to actually be Ingrid Kavan, who was, among other things, Fassbinder's wife at one time. And it seems to be louder than the dialogue at that point. I mean, he's deliberately layering that on there like that. Certainly with the levels of TV and things like that, I got the impression, and I don't speak German, as my German teacher from high school will tell you, but I got the impression that you're supposed to hear it mostly in fragments. You're not supposed to be able to identify, oh, that's what they're talking about, or that's who that is, or that's what TV show they're watching. That it had kind of a layered effect. That was the way it struck me. But again, not knowing what they were saying, I mean, there were lots of times when obviously the stuff on the TV, things like that, aren't getting translated subtitles, and I found that kind of frustrating on a couple of occasions. Somebody's talking an awful lot. We should have at least a sense of what they're saying. So in that sense, yeah, it may be a deliberate effect. And as I said, one of the in possibly the only interview Fassbinder gave about this film, the journalist he was talking to did refer to it as audio terrorism. So, and so it may be designed to keep the audience just a little uncomfortable, just a little bit at edge. And in that respect, it sort of works.
Well, it's so hard, as like in people that don't speak English, when we're relying on the subtitles, details like that just completely get lost on us. So I always kind of have to remind myself that maybe if you are a German person, you can't understand what they're saying at all. So moving on, what, 3 or 4 years after this film, Fassbinder died by way of drug overdose. And here he's got a character who dies by a drug overdose. I feel like this film reads maybe sort of critical of drugs. It's not positive in the way that Fassbinder tended to be. Like, he was working on a screenplay for cocaine when he died.
Right,
Um,
and he also made Veronica Voss, which is a powerful film about a drug addict. I mean, he certainly was aware of drugs as a problem. I don't want to speak to what his own, what his own drug use was like or why he did it, and yet you do get the impression that he sees it as I won't say a weakness, um, maybe but certainly a danger, a threat. It's not something he's. I mean, the fact that he can see other people, and there's lots of his films deal with drug addicts. When you think about it, um, he doesn't celebrate it, but he can't quite step away from it. I can't think of any cases where he glorifies or celebrates the use of drugs, or has a character saying, "Wow, I just can't wait to go home and shoot up," or what have you. So that is a strange quality in his work. I mean, Veronica Voss was one of his very last films. So clearly, I mean, some people would say it's either painfully ironic or outright hypocritical to be making a film about some drug addict's problems when you yourself are using drugs, I suppose. But that's not, he doesn't come at it from a moralistic point of view. He just sees it as a force, a temptation, something that you can't resist, I guess. It's kind of curious. I mean, Ilsa is kind of a cipher in this film. She doesn't do, she really has absolutely nothing on her mind except looking for her stats or things like that. She really does not say a coherent thing other than that, other than that throughout the film. And clearly that's by design. I mean, he wants to show that that's exactly how consumed she is, and yet she's not really treated particularly tragically. I mean, obviously Franz thinks so, but I mean, it's just that's her position. That's what she does. It's a curious thing, and it's there's no romanticization in his drug use in the films, and that's kind of very odd. Um, I'm sure there's probably more to be considered and thought about that, since I know there are several other films that do involve uh, drug addiction in one form or another. But Veronica Voss in particular is kind of the classic addiction type story. It's sort of like it could be an old Susan Hayward movie or something in respect, but um, unflinchingly so, and certainly, but certainly with no glorification or romanticization of drugs in it. I mean, that's doesn't seem to occur to him. In his episode in Germany in Autumn, he does show himself taking drugs, and there is one point in which he becomes paranoid and believes the police are about to come to the door and has, throws them all down the toilet. So he was not afraid to show that side of himself, but he doesn't seem to be making any strong position for it one way or another. It's a curious thing. So
I'll put in a last call for questions from the audience. I've only got one more of my own. So if you have burning questions before we shut down, please do type them in the Q&A box now. But with that said, my last question is, I remember from your class, you didn't require us to read, but you recommended the Christian Brad Thompson book, Fassbinder, The Life and Work of a Provocative Genius. And in that book, Thompson implicates that the third generation is something of a nightmare film. And I'm wondering if you read this film, Fassbinder experimented with genre, most especially melodrama. Um, but here it's almost as if he's experimenting with the horror film. Do you view this film as a horror film at all? Is this what like a Fassbinder version of a horror film would be?
um, I don't know that I would say a horror film. He did write a vampire story, Tenders of the Wolves, which someone else directed. Um, I think the films that I sort of lumped this in with, Satan's Brew, Chinese Roulette, to a certain degree, Despair, they do show characters who are somewhat monstrous, and somewhat dangerous to society. Um, the point is not necessarily to scare the audience as much as it is just to show you this is how horrible these people have become. Um, I mean, there are horrible people in other Fassbinder films like The Family and the Merchant of Four Seasons, but this is a different kind of horror, and they are monstrous in that regard. But again, he's doing it with kind of to a certain degree, a satiric way. It's just this is how. I don't know if you've ever seen Satan's Brew, for example,
Mhm.
but I mean that would be an example of in a very very broad, very absurd way that the Harry Bear character is just absolutely terrible. to everyone in every respect. And that's kind of what the terrorists in the third generation aren't really cruel to each other in that same sense, but they really are so self-absorbed that they have no idea what the repercussions of what they're doing are, and they don't really care. It really does become a giant game to them. And they think that they're sort of protected and outside society, that so that they can act like that they can just, they can essentially just behave without thinking about the consequences, as Fassbinder described it. And I think that's so the films that I'm categorizing, I wouldn't say are horror as much as they are really, really almost crude characters of bad behavior.
Well, I think Satan's Brew, In a Year with 13 Moons, and The Third Generation are maybe the trio of best Volker Spengler performances in a Fassbinder film. I was thinking earlier, I'm not sure that there's a question there, but that there's an interesting duality. We've got Volker Spengler's Irvin / Elvira in A Year with 13 Moons, and then in Third Generation, he's the double agent. So he's very much a split personality in this one.
He's very odd in this film. He's sort of like, I was reminded in some ways of Truman Capote. And he's sort of foppish, and he sort of thinks he's sort of above everyone, and he doesn't really do anything to indicate that. You can just tell that he just thinks they're there to do whatever he says. And yet he also has this weird side that indulges in dressing up as a woman to go see Eddie Constantine, and he's accused of having this fondness for costumes. Yet that's the only time we see him do that. He is sort of, he does have this idealized, maybe sort of a James Bond version of himself, where he has to do all these extravagant things when in fact he really doesn't do much of anything at all. He's really just using everybody. So it's an interesting, subtle performance. In a Year with 13 is of course a whole different thing, because that had to be just an ordeal to go through a role like that and take the weight of that much sheer tragedy on yourself while still indulging in Jerry Lewis impressions. But yeah, so it's a very interesting, subtle touch in this film. That one of the problems with having so many characters is, of course, they don't really get a whole lot of time to do a whole lot. We don't know a whole lot about Margaret Carstensen's character, other than the fact she doesn't like her husband. They have to, in a sense, be sort of relatively simple. You have to know everything about Udo Kier's neuroses the first time you see him, because it's not going to develop into a storyline. And that's true of Bulle Ogier, it's true of almost all the characters. And so there's not a lot to work with. And the fact that August doesn't really have to do anything except sort of manipulate everybody gives him that he doesn't have to have any outward neuroses. He can just sort of walk through it all very smoothly. He's sort of he's sort of like the secret mastermind. And Volker Spengler captures that in a very unusual way for him in particular. It's a very weirdly cool performance.
That's a good way to put it. I like Volker Spengler a lot. Anyway, we're out of questions. I'm out of questions, and we don't have any more audience questions. And we're also basically out of time anyway, so the timing worked out great. So with that, I wanted to thank you once again, Robert, and invite everyone else to come to our March of Coppola events next month, including Lost in Translation a week from tonight. Robert, do you have any closing thoughts?
Gosh, do I? No, not really. I'm surprised and pleased to hear the attendance for this has been as strong as it has been for these events, because Fassbinder is, I think he's very accessible in a lot of ways, but we don't pay a lot of attention to anything that's more than 6 months old these days. It's very, very difficult to get an audience excited about anything if it's already on its second weekend at theaters. I think that's one of the drawbacks of our time is that we have unfortunately allowed the film industries to cultivate this novelty of whatever's new and fresh and forget everything else until we get a chance to remake it. And so it's always nice to see any kind of extended look at certainly a filmmaker as important as Fassbinder, but it's unfortunately it's not what the commercial film culture really allows us to do very often these days, because they're too busy showing this week's crude sequel. So in that respect, it's just a nice touch. I'm glad to see this has worked out well.
Yeah, me too.
And Sofia Coppola might be an interesting choice too. So
Yeah, thanks. I feel like it does bear mentioning actually. I knew like of Fassbinder. He was a filmmaker that I wanted to explore. But when I took your class in 2003, I don't think I had seen any of his films at all. I think I saw my first Fassbinder in your class. And the main reason why was at the time you couldn't get Fassbinder movies at Blockbuster. And Blockbuster all but had a monopoly on video rental stores. So you could get Fassbinder films on VHS. They existed, but you couldn't get them at Blockbuster, which basically meant you couldn't get them. But I think that we're dealing with kind of a weird variation on that problem now, where at least we can get these on the Criterion channel. I don't think our patrons have had a hard time finding them, but still, don't fall into that Blockbuster whirlpool again with like Netflix or anything
Sure,
else.
sure.
Anyway,
I think Martin Scorsese has been trying to warn us about that lately. But
well, thanks again, Robert, and thanks to everyone for coming. Have a good night.